I want to give you guys a brief overview of how to use the Madonna databases. Some of you may be familiar with those databases, or maybe you've used databases at another school, but the ones at Madonna look a little different, and you may be unfamiliar with using them to find sources for humanities-based projects. So you're welcome to use any of the databases available at Madonna, and we can get to those by going from the library's homepage to the Databases tab here. You're welcome to select a database with this drop-down menu. I know ProQuest is one that many students use a lot and are comfortable with. You're welcome to look into that, but sometimes ProQuest is more science-focused, so it may not yield you the same results, but still worth looking into. I like to, for my humanities projects, go to clicking here to see the databases organized in a different manner. So if I go to the by subject option, it gives me a link to arts and humanities. The one I want to highlight for you guys is the humanities source, and that's going to take us to an EBSCOhost database. So let's say I want to use an example from a book we're not reading for this class. So let's say I want to write about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. First and foremost, because of the nature of Madonna's databases, it can be useful to just search the title of one of your pieces that you're writing about first and see what pops up. Sometimes, like in this case, we might want to actually put Austen's name in. It might just narrow our focus a little bit, though as we can see, we're getting a few decent results for sources about Pride and Prejudice. So I might say, okay, I'm not really sure if I like those sources, so I might add in another keyword, and gender, right? Because that's maybe the topic I want to focus on is gender norms in Pride and Prejudice. So that's going to give me a little bit more focus here. And then here we get something right about gender differences in Pride and Prejudice. Some of the same things are popping up again, but gaze, right? So I can find some connection to the male gaze here. So again, it looks like there's some interesting sources that could be relevant to my paper if I was writing it. And also, right, did limit our results quite a bit. So I'm going to limit it further by clicking that full text option. That's just going to ensure that anything I click on I can actually read. It's very frustrating if you've got a really good source, but you click on it and we don't have access to it at Madonna. It's best if you kind of check that full text off since it limits your sources right away. If we go back to Madonna's databases link, we can search by vendor. And so this gives you access to go to EBSCOhost in general. From here there's also JSTOR, and I'm going to click over to where I already have that open. And JSTOR can be another good source, both in your other studies, but also for humanities classes. So in this case, I'm going to put in Pride and Prejudice, again starting very general with my title. You see that gives me a lot of results, 67,000. So I'm going to narrow that focus by going to the Content I Can Access link at the bottom. And that's really going to only give me things I can actually read. And if I wanted to narrow it further to like journal articles, I could do that, which I think I'm going to do. Making sure I'm getting my academic journal articles. So this idea of the psychology of prejudice could be an interesting way of looking at the different ways characters experience prejudice or express prejudice in the novel. So just as a reminder, one of your sources needs to come from the databases, or be an academic journal article that you get from another route. So I have here a Google Scholars search that I did on Pride and Prejudice, Austen, and gender. And right, if we look at just these first few that are available here in a PDF, here is a book chapter, gender and class oppression in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, constructing Mr. Darcy. Both of these would count as database sources, even though they're not coming from the Madonna databases. These are clearly from academic journal articles, in this case a book. This one's coming from ProQuest. So when I say that one of your sources needs to be a database source, it could also though come from another route. Alternatively, a book would also count as a database source. So if you were to go to the library and find an ebook, and go to the library's catalog, or your local library's catalog, or if you find an ebook on Google Books can be a great way to just read a chapter or an excerpt even of a book. Even if the whole book is not available, it can still be a useful way to have some research sources. So I'm going to the catalogs here, and let's say I want to look up Prejudice. So now I've got the library results for Pride and Prejudice. In this case, I want to check off electronic resources so I can see what I can access just on my computer. I've seen a few sources now that talk about autism and Pride and Prejudice, so it could be that your research source inspires an interesting paper topic. Again, kind of a companion novel to Jane Austen. So you can also think about using the library as a resource for ebooks. And then last but not least, of course, your other source is allowed to be from a more casual source. Again, it should still be academic, reliable, still be a formal source, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a database or academic journal article. So I'm going to type in again here, Pride and Prejudice and Gender. And if I'm going through these sources, right, SparkNotes is obviously not an academic source. It's a reference guide, but not something that's super prestigious. Medium, I've kind of heard of that publication, so it would be okay. Some of these things, I looked at this wasn't really relevant. Divaportal.org, never heard of that. Prezi, it's going to be some kind of student presentation. A blog is not very reliable. But I do have a really good source here from The Atlantic, which then I know is a reliable magazine that has a lot of clout to it, so it would count as a very good academic source. If you had something from the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, the Washington Post, Newsweek, Time magazine, you also might find something from a university, or you might find something from, like here, the Chicago Public Library, or another reliable organization, or a museum, or potentially even a government organization if it was something from Britain where there was a national interest in, like, Jane Austen's history or her biography. NPR, again, could be a great reliable source there. BBC would be very reliable. So the big takeaway is to, again, make sure you've got those two research sources for the final paper. One from the databases or a book, or from Google Scholar, or even from a Google search. Sometimes you can find academic journal articles just in a general Google search like this. So a database source or a database-like source, and that second source just making sure it's still reliable and academic. You're more than welcome to use two sources from the databases, but it's not required. Just make sure you have at least the one. And again, these sources should support what you're saying in some way, add on to the argument you're making and your interpretation that you're giving in your paper. They shouldn't really be the main focus. So weaving in those words from the sources to support what you're saying in your analysis.